Welcome to the France 24 debate. They got Brexit done. Let's show you the images then of the Brexit Party event organised in London 3 nights ago to celebrate the moment voted in a referendum back in June 2016. The UK then, there you go, counting down. We're out, it says. The UK's left the EU. But another chapter now opens. After Brexit, the negotiations for a fresh relationship with Brussels and the 27 member states of the EU that remain. So 47 years of marriage, a messy divorce, and now the real work begins. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson spoke earlier in Greenwich, East London.
Free trade is being choked. The protectionists are gaining ground. From Brussels to China to Washington, tariffs are being waved around like cudgels, even in debates on foreign policy, where, frankly, they have no place.
The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson there. Michel Barnier, the EU's negotiator for Brexit, spoke in Brussels.
We are ready to offer a highly ambitious trade deal as the central pillar of this partnership, including zero tariffs and zero quotas on all goods. This exceptional offer is conditional on at least two things. First, we need to make sure competition is and remains open and fair. Second, our free trade agreement must include an agreement on fisheries.
So, Boris Johnson, Michel Barnier, where now in this brave new Brexit world? Our guests to discuss this, and we're looking for, well, they've got 11 months to get the solutions. Our guests have got a little shorter. On set, Catherine Goron, who's assistant professor at Pont-Assas University and member of CREW, which is the Economic Research Unit Lab. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure to have you. On the other side of our studio, they're not necessarily against, but we will discover. Michel de Fabiani, who's Vice President of the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Great to see you. And we have two guests joining us from London. John Worth is Visiting Fellow at the College of Europe in Bruges, but joining us, as I say, from London. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
Good evening.
And also joining us from London, Simon Brewer, who's the former Chief Investment Officer at Morgan Stanley Bank. Simon, thanks for being with us.
Good to be back, thank you.
Let's launch our debate then at this juncture to talk with, we heard from Boris Johnson, we've heard from Michel Barnier. Catherine, here in the studio, when you heard both those men speak, did you feel optimistic, or do you feel optimistic now about the 11 months to come? Do you think there'll be great strides of progress, or will it just be like basically two boxers slugging each other toe-to-toe in the middle of a boxing ring?
Well, I think as a research fellow, what I understood is that those two people are totally different. One, Michel Barnier, thinks that things have to be written, an agreement has to be written, while Boris Johnson speaks about free trade, and for him, the agreement, exactly like the British Constitution, doesn't have to be written, and rules probably do not play the same part whether you are in Europe or you are in the UK. So I think here it would be, I'm optimistic, but I'm also doing some research, and I'm afraid here, until those two visions of negotiations, and particularly of the result of the negotiation, find a way, it will be difficult.
The phrase, of course, vive la différence is coming to mind, long live the difference between the two countries. Michel de Fabiani, do you think that, as Catherine is saying, is the fundamental problem? There is such a divergence on what each side sees as the right route to take, that putting the two together is proving nigh on impossible?
Well, this is a cultural difference. There are so many cultural differences in Europe between the Germans and the French, not to say the least, or Italians and the Nordics, for instance. So I'm not worried about that. I think the business needs a trade agreement. And the CBI today published a memorandum, and it starts with, we will remain a constructive member of Business Europe, which is the Confederation of European Business. So business is there, needs to continue. It's interesting that fisheries has been mentioned by Michel Barnier, but frankly, fisheries are not the entire world of business. It's a small, typical, problematic, emotional activity, but it's small.
It is one thing that got many people very angry, though, and even off Guernsey now, there's a row over access to the waters.
Yeah, but I mean, what's happening today is a minor incident. I know this incident between Morocco and Spain for fisheries happen every week. So the important thing is that there will be a test for July, by the end of June, on fisheries, amongst others. But this one is used as a sort of tool.
You'll see how that one goes. And we're not saying that it's a small thing if you're in the fishing industry. We're not belittling what you're going through, but we're saying that it's part of a far bigger picture of what this Brexit deal is about. Michel, understood you completely on that. Well, let's bring in Simon Brewer from Morgan Stanley. Simon, on the news of what was said today, I understand the pound fell, which I don't know whether that's good news or bad news for you, sir. You tell me.
Well, it was previously Morgan Stanley and quite a long time ago, but...
sorry.
Short-term quite all right. Short-term gyrations in the foreign exchange markets are of little consequence to the future trajectory of trade and the UK working, in the new form in which it will. So I think we are recognising that the EU has some closely held desires, some red lines, which may indeed have to be found to be more flexible, because although the administration and Boris Johnson's already shown, I think last week with Huawei, a certain pragmatism. I think buoyed by an unequivocal mandate, he won't yield. And the notion that the UK will be forced to accept EU rules is not going to happen, no more than the EU should be forced to accept UK trading rules. So I think there's a pretty tough set of negotiations that lie ahead, not insurmountable. But unlike May, who is trying to placate multiple constituencies without success, Boris Johnson has no need to feel obliged to pursue such a policy.
And the key to that is this 80-seat majority that he's got in the December the 12th election, just gone.
Indeed.
Simon Brewer, formerly of Morgan Stanley. I will not make that mistake a second time. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. Let's bring in John Worth, visiting fellow at the College of Europe in Bruges. John, in terms of what we're hearing and what we've heard today, how does it leave you feeling about the possibility of something being sorted out very swiftly over the next few months?
I think you have to look at what's happened today as essentially the first skirmishes in what's going to come between now and the end of the year, and probably even longer. Basically, the European Union side is very well prepared. It knows exactly what it wants, and it knows how to get it. It's got a good team that knows how to do trade negotiations. On the other side, the UK knows what it doesn't want. It doesn't want to be that close to the European Union, but it doesn't know exactly what it does want in a way that can be positively articulated. And so basically, Brussels is saying, OK, Britain, here you are. There's the dotted line. This is where you need to sign. And Boris Johnson is saying, we're not so keen on that. But they don't actually know what the alternative would be. And so ultimately, as I see it, if Boris Johnson wants to stick to his timetable of getting all of this done and dusted by the end of this year, just 11 months, as you've said, he's going to have to manage to stomach a lot of what the European Union is proposing, because there's not going to be any other option for him. If Boris Johnson were to compromise on the timetable, then he might be able to get what would in his eyes be perhaps a better deal for the UK. But essentially, a quick deal is going to be a deal that's in the interests of the EU, not in the interests of the UK.
And of course, politically for Boris Johnson, regardless of his massive majority, regardless of the landslide election win, if he doesn't produce a deal that looks like it's completely within his own interests, within the UK's interests, then presumably his electorate might turn on him.
Maybe not the electorate immediately, but I think his own Conservative members of Parliament will potentially turn on him. In order to manage to get all of the Conservative MPs on board, there was a certain compromise that Boris Johnson had to basically give. It was essentially, we want a Brexit with a deal rather than a no-deal Brexit, but according to a very tight timetable, i.e. managing to get this all done and dusted, end of the transition period, by the end of this year. And so that was essentially the deal he struck with his own members of Parliament, including the hardliners, the so-called European Research Group. And so those are going to be the members of Parliament that are going to be giving Boris Johnson a hard time if he can't manage to get all of this done by the end of the year.
John Worth in London, thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to the studio with Catherine Coren and Michel de Fabiani here. In terms of what happens next, in terms of, Catherine, in terms of sitting down and talking, I mean, clearly, as you pointed out, two people with two different philosophies going in two different ways. How do they begin to sort of like find the common ground? Because that common ground has existed for 47 years, theoretically, or in a structure called the European Union. They've decided to break out of that, the British, and now, of course, we need to work out how we can actually work together, trade together, live alongside each other going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid it's going to be difficult to find a common ground. Maybe, as you mentioned, if Boris Johnson really wants to get an agreement, he may start accepting a certain number of so-called rules. To me, the question of regulation is really important. Again, not only in the British Constitution, but in finance. London has become one of the most important financial places because it is deregulated. So we can see that freedom for the UK means no rules. And again, I think Europe will not accept that. The financial crisis came because the economy, the finance was deregulated, and European people know it. They have 27 countries believing the same, and they will probably disagree with Great Britain if they don't accept to have financial rules. We also have climate. And if we really want to save the planet, we need to have the same rules. And everybody has to accept them. And I do believe they have to be written, particularly for business. I think business has to now adapt to climate change. And if we need norms or whatever, but we probably need to work together. So deciding the way the UK does today to have kind of bilateral agreements instead of as many countries as we can, to me is dangerous. For the UK economy, which is not going well, UK growth is nearly 0%. The pound is not doing well too. Trade deficit is huge. It's the most important in the UK, in Europe, and they need the common market. So having said that, Boris Johnson may say we don't want any rules, yet I'm afraid that he needs to take into consideration the economic side of all the debate.
Indeed, the economy is stupid, as Bill Clinton once said. Catherine, thank you. I know Simon Brewer in London is itching to get in on this one. Simon, former Chief Investment Officer at Morgan Stanley. Sir, with the good humour that I know you have, I will let you loose. What do you think about this idea of regulation, the idea that, of course, finance is going to play a key role in what happens next?
Well, I just want to come back to your previous speaker who made some, I thought, interesting observations. The pound is weak and the UK economy is not doing well. I think if she would like to look at some of the data going back to the last 5 years, we'll see the UK has outgrown all of its European counterparts. And what is interesting, and I see it because I am in the world of investment decisions being made both in private and public businesses, is the inward investment and the decisions that are taking place, I think will translate into quite a smart pickup in growth over the coming quarters and years, and I don't think the same could be said for Europe. So I think if you return to regulation, I think that we know the separation between the EU and the UK is in part a disagreement about future policy direction, about federalism and about control, and I think the UK is not afraid of saying, well, if we can't strike a deal, either in that time period or shortly around it, I think will go the way of something like in Australia. So there's, the EU trades with Australia on WTO rules, plus some side agreements. And I don't think the UK is afraid of that. And I think the EU will increasingly recognise that whilst they have their red lines, the UK may simply say that the inflexibility and the intransigence of the EU, which has been typical of negotiations up to now, I think will result in quite a marked possibility of no deal at all.
Indeed, no deal. That's. I wondered how long it would be before we mentioned the term no deal. Simon, you've won the award. Thank you very much, sir. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Michel de Fabiani, you want to say something?
Yeah, the business doesn't believe in no deal and doesn't want no deal. And the business is the reality of life. I compare the business as the earth. We live on the earth. We are down to earth. And the political people are the clouds. So it can rain or it can be sunshine from one moment to another. Political people disappear, the business remains. This being said, to come back to regulation, I think the important point is the norms of a profession, professional norms. I think we don't speak enough of the professional European organizations, sometimes worldwide organizations, who create and agree on norms in pharmaceuticals, in the car industry, in the electric, in the energy, etc. To take a past example, the car industry and the energy industry were much more powerful than the politicians to create norms for the cars. And in the electric sector, it will be the same. So I believe the people who really make life for people and jobs will insist on having a deal. Now, whether it's a Canadian, don't forget the Canadian deal was mentioned also, and it's much more positive than the Australian deal, I think. And a deal is a deal, and it contains what people put in it. And the business, the CBI has taken a clear position. You mentioned climate change. They also said climate change is something which is European at least and worldwide. The Paris Agreement includes the UK, as far as I know, until
Yes,
today.
it still does, yes.
And still again. Energy security is also another important matter, and it's European, whether you like it or not. And a sustainable finance plan is something which, of course, the banks have norms, and more these norms are becoming applicable to all, what I would say, the proud banks.
So
So
those norms are really important. Michel, I need to pause you there. I know that John Worth is dying to get in, but John, bear with us. You're first in straight after the break. Short pause, then part two coming up straight away.
Hello, I'm Annette Young, the host of the 51%, and in this week's special edition, we're coming to you from Dakar in Senegal. In the last decade, tens of millions of young African women have taken up modern contraception. But in many countries such as this one, sex outside of marriage is still very much taboo, making the fight for reproductive rights that much more difficult. We're going to be meeting the people, however, who are determined to get the message across.
The 51%, presented by Annette Young on France 24 and France24.com.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
France 24, a different point of view.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Watching France 24, these are the headlines. The Democrat presidential contenders face the first decisive hurdle. The candidate who wins in Iowa is often the one who eventually wins the presidential nomination. We're following all developments through our correspondent Kervan Gorgistani, who is there. The latest on the coronavirus alert, the figures have risen. 361 people now have died due to this virus. And the first outside China is in the Philippines. France has 6 people currently infected and a group of people in quarantine just back from China. No need for the UK to follow EU rules on trade. Boris Johnson's first salvo on what promises to be a rocky road ahead to negotiate the post-Brexit trade deal between the UK and the EU 27. And that is the subject of our debate. French President Emmanuel Macron said he's neither pro nor anti-Russia, he's simply pro-Europe. He was speaking in Poland, where he went to discuss cooperation on defence and energy matters, going some way to try to mend the Paris-Warsaw relationship. Poland has made it known they want to take part in a project to help build the European tank. Welcome back to the France 24 debate. We're discussing the next steps for the Brexit negotiations. Now, Brexit has been done and dusted. So getting Brexit done is one thing, an oven-ready deal cooked, but getting the next phase sorted is, well, another fish to fry. Within 11 months of negotiations in store, we're hoping that things will happen. Our guests here will try and analyse what they think should happen, but they haven't got 11 months to do it. Just another, 20 minutes or so of what's left of this debate. Our guests are Catherine Corrin, Assistant Professor at Panthéon-Assas University, a member of CREW Economic Research Unit Lab. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
On the other side of our studio, Michel de Fabiani, the Vice President of the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for being with us, sir. Joining us by satellite from London, we have John Worth, Visiting Fellow at the College of Europe in Bruges. Thank you, John, for being with us. And by duplex, also from London, Simon Brewer, former Chief Investment Officer at Morgan Stanley. Thank you all. Thank you, Simon. Thank you all for being with us. Before I let you all loose again, let's take a look at Boris Johnson and Michel Barnier's positions this Monday in a report by Claire Rush.
The post-Brexit showdown over trade has begun. Brussels says it's ready to offer the UK a highly ambitious trade deal, including zero tariffs and zero quotas on goods, on two conditions.
First, we need to make sure competition is and remains open and fair. Second, our free trade agreement must include an agreement on fisheries.
The fishing industry will be central in upcoming trade talks, as Brussels pushes for its fishermen to have continued access to UK waters. It's estimated that EU vessels rely on British waters for more than a third of their catch. Meanwhile, the bloc is also insisting on having a level playing field. It's concerned that the UK, now a new competitor at its doorstep, will undercut its regulations regarding social and environmental standards, a fear dismissed by Boris Johnson. The British Prime Minister says he won't seek to undermine the bloc with a race to the bottom, but that he won't accept all EU rules either.
There is no need for a free trade agreement to involve accepting EU rules on competition policies, subsidies, social protection, the environment, or anything similar, any more than the EU should be obliged to accept UK rules. The UK will maintain the highest standards in these areas, better, in many respects, than those of the EU, without the compulsion of a treaty.
Johnson wants to strike a deal similar to the one between the EU and Canada, which eliminates tariffs on most goods but maintains customs checks. The two sides now have until the end of the year to reach an agreement, an ambitious timetable and a cause for concern for some in Brussels who fear the chances of making a deal in 11 months are slim. Some analysts predict that if little progress is made by mid-year, the EU may switch tack into damage control mode, focusing instead on mitigating the risks of a potential no-deal crash-out rather than reaching a trade agreement.
Thanks to Claire Rush for that recalling of the events of the day, and of course a good chance to listen to both Boris Johnson and Michel Barnier speaking there. Let's go back to our guest, John Worth, Visiting Fellow, College of Europe in Bruges, but joining us by satellite from London. John, you wanted to come back on points that were made in part one.
Well, we know overall that Brexit is going to have an economic cost to the UK. The question is ultimately that Britain has not really accepted that that's going to be the case. And we hear from Boris Johnson today this contradiction that Britain wants to diverge from the European Union in terms of standards, but at the same time says, well, we're going to maintain maintain similar or go for even higher standards in environment and social protection, which leaves you wondering, what is the point of all of this in the first place? I.e., you can't be taking back control while at the same time saying you actually want to maintain the same sorts of standards, but just without the compulsion. Because ultimately, if you are a car manufacturer or a pharmaceutical company, you need the legal certainty to know that your goods are going to be able to be exported and under what terms. And so therefore, for your guest there from the British French Chamber of Commerce, is completely correct to say that business needs certainty and it needs clarity, and it needs that certainty and clarity as soon as possible. And just Boris Johnson saying, actually, we don't want to diverge in terms of standards is definitely not enough. And bear in mind that the British electorate essentially has been taken in by Boris Johnson at the general election in December. I'm pretty sure that the European Union is not going to be willing to trust Boris Johnson at his word in the way the British electorate was.
Some good news today, John, that Nissan thinking of putting its eggs into the Sunderland basket rather than putting it into its EU plants. What do you make of that?
I'm not commenting on that leak because we have no reassurance that that is actually the plan of the current chief executive of Nissan that was leaked yesterday evening or this morning to the Financial Times. So I don't think that that's worth debating.
You've got my source and I've got your comment and we're moving it from there, sir. Thank you very much indeed and I appreciate your frankness on that one. Simon Brew, would you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm always stunned that the academic community knows that there's going to be a cost to the UK economy, which is all the more ironic given the Eurosclerosis that has prevailed for so long. So I'm significantly more optimistic. And as I said, perhaps because I'm in the world where business decisions, investment decisions are being made, there's a lot that was put on hold that is now being made and actioned and investments are flowing through. So I feel very constructive. Now, there will be pragmatism. I think that, as I mentioned earlier on in the Huawei deal, is there fisheries for finance deal? You know, there are areas of sensitivity, but there are areas of give and take. So I don't preclude a deal being done in the time that's allocated. But I certainly think that the negativity which hung over much of the commentary, which was rejected by the UK electorate, I think we'll see surprisingly sprightly growth from the UK, as I mentioned earlier on.
Simon, I have a friend who works in health and safety.
That goes against all of the research which has been conducted. And essentially, you're against the prevailing view of academics and economists that the UK is going to take an economic hit from Brexit. Just this week, BMW has put its plans for building the new Mini on hold as a result of the uncertainty caused due to the Brexit negotiations. So if there is this great business ready to save the UK, where is it then, please, Simon? Give me an example of a company that's since December said, OK, we've got great optimism.
Simon, go ahead and answer John.
I'll give you two. Yeah, with great pleasure. I think what has been so interesting is to see successive companies, I'll just name two of them, Amazon and Google, make continued investments into the UK, notwithstanding the uncertainty that prevailed prior to the election.
British.
And I see it. I think that the siren calls of the Remainers, of whom you clearly still are one, unhappy to accept both the referendum and then the electoral outcome of the December election, fail to recognise that there is a lot happening here, and it's in marked contrast to a lot of what I see in Europe.
John, go ahead.
Sorry, this is typical that I perfectly accept the result. And to just trade personal blows in that nature just undermines your argument, ultimately. Of course I accept the result. That's absolutely fine. I still maintain that it is economically not a sensible decision economically for the UK to have left the European Union. The question is, what now can you save from that, or how do you wish to save it? Now, basically, throughout my adult life, the British Conservative Party has been an economically responsible party. That economic responsibility of the party is out of the window. Can you really look a Nissan worker in the eye or a Mini worker in the eye and essentially say, your jobs are going to be in a safer situation as a result of Brexit than if Britain had not gone through with that? No, you can't. Britain is doing it. There's a political reason for doing it, don't get me wrong. But in terms of the uncertainty that causes for investment decisions, it is not a good economic call. You have to accept that, at least. And I accept the political result of the referendum, even though I voted the other way round. But ultimately, don't let it come to personal blows, Simon. You should be better than that.
Gentlemen, can I pause you both and bring the discussion back to the studio to let our guests here have a safer moment, then I'll come back to you. Here in the studio, Catherine Coran from the Panthéon Assas University, and Michel de Fabiani from the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce. We're hearing. I was going to make the point about things being written down, and I have a friend who works in health and safety who says that things are going to change immensely in terms of health and safety for British workers because of what's happening. That point kind of swept aside by the energetic argument from John and Simon there in London, and I get that because there is so many issues in this that are so wide-reaching and important to so many people. Catherine, you've heard what was said. What was your point you wanted to make?
My point was about uncertainty and the fact that as far as economics is concerned, there is a lag between the time when the decision is made and the impact on the economy. Unfortunately, politicians not always know about that, so there will be an impact of all the agreements which are made today. Uncertainty started in 2016, had an impact on the UK economy, which is now having growth which is stagnating. And it will go on unless there is a deal. And if there is no deal, probably the impact on the economy is going to be higher. This is what all economists agree upon.
Is it fair to say growth in most European countries is stagnating, though? Because France hasn't grown, has it?
It was more particularly important in the UK because it was doing better before this uncertainty period. The other question I was just trying to answer was what does a fair competition mean? I don't think it means the same for Michel Barnier and for Boris Johnson. So unless they agree upon what it means, there will be no solution.
Michel?
Well, if you are in a company, you apply the same rules in your company wherever you operate. And I'm talking about large corporations. If you are a BP or Total, or you are professional norms are very similar, health, safety, employment. You have supply chain observations which you need to respect, and whether you are in Bangladesh or Germany, you have to make a real company policy. So I think what I like to hear today was the highest standards from Boris Johnson fit with the highly ambitious deal of Michel Barnier. And those two, if they can be combined, and believe me, the business on both sides of the channel, Europe without UK not in Europe, will promote these two expressions and find the right thing. Because after all, we work for people, for our customers, for jobs, for our employees, for the municipalities where we operate, the sites. And nobody wants an unfair competition and lower standards. That was said. So I hope reason will prevail, and reason is usually what business does.
So if tariffs are imposed because there's no agreement, if these restrictions are imposed because there's no agreement.
Yeah, but we are not on a no agreement hypothesis. No agreement is the end of the
It's the end of the line.
Of nothing. It's not the beginning. So please look at the beginning, and I retain, maybe I'm optimistic, but I retain the positive positions which could be aligned one day. Not 100% for each, but Barnier and Johnson can find the right compromise. Because after all, economic life is about compromise. We all know that.
Simon Brewer, economic life is about compromise. Your comments on that, sir?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, that's why I said that I think whether it's fisheries for finance or other pragmatic decisions, deals will be done. I mean, we are dealing with a philosophical divergence which has led to Brexit, which is a European model which is federalist and heavier on regulation, and a UK model that is more independent and seeks lighter regulation. So I don't think we should confuse or try and kid ourselves that we can have harmonization of those rules and standards. There can be equivalence, but I think we have to accept that over time there will be divergence in a number of areas.
John Worth?
The thing is that if we look at what we've seen since 2016, the pragmatic economic outcome here would have been a soft Brexit, kind of a Norway model, if you like. And what is currently on the table, and Boris Johnson today talking about a kind of Canada-style free trade agreement, is a very long way away from that soft Brexit. Also, in the political declaration that was agreed in the autumn, there was an acceptance that there will have to be customs controls between the UK and the EU, even though Britain's foreign minister doesn't seem to understand that. So economic pragmatism has not determined where we've got to until now. What I'd like to hear from the other guests is, why should that be any different now? I don't really see Boris Johnson suddenly becoming an economic pragmatist, because he and the Conservative Party have not played that line ever since 2016. So I'm rather sceptical about this. I think that from an economic point of view, Boris Johnson will be willing to play the card to say, well, we're going to have a hard Brexit. Even if that comes at an economic cost, well, that was what the people voted for, so that's what we're going to get.
So you're saying you think this is all basically playing towards a hard Brexit in X months' time?
Exactly, and also playing on this kind of victim role that he's also been developing, essentially saying, OK, well, the reason this all went wrong was not because of us, it was because of those difficult negotiators in Brussels who were too hard towards us, ultimately. And therefore, it's easier to make an excuse for it going wrong than it is to actually tack towards a more pragmatic outcome. And there's been scant little pragmatism in the UK's approach for the last 3 years. And so, therefore, I'm very sceptical about whether this pragmatism will come to pass in the next 11 months. Why should it?
Indeed, in that line, no need for the UK to follow EU rules on trade. Michel, do you think that is an indication that Boris Johnson's pushing towards a no-deal Brexit?
It is true, there is no need, formal need, but there is a practical need, which is if you want jobs, if you want investment, if you want industries and services to continue, you need some rules. Now, whether they are EU rules, UK rules, or a combination of both, and you mentioned the equivalent. I liked the sentence. Equivalent for me is fine, even if it's not written exactly in the same way on both sides. If it's equivalent, it's fine.
Simon Brewer, why would Boris Johnson push towards a no-deal Brexit? Can you give us any insight, any thought, any feeling on that one?
Well, I was the one who referred to the equivalence, and that's why I think that one can believe pragmatic accommodations can be arrived at. But he will push for, or he will say that a no deal is the only option if what is on the table is essentially an EU-light set of arrangements, i.e. a synthetic EU that we had before. That with sort of jurisdiction of the ECJ and having to accept standards of the EU, that won't be acceptable because that would, I think, compromise the nature of the departure. And I think, therefore, as we looked and we've talked on the show before, when you look at the trading that the UK and the EU has done with the US, which doesn't have a trade agreement, or Japan until recently, or China, right products sold at the right price, will work. Businessmen know how to get things done, and there can be some interruptions and there can be some short-term economic costs. But if one's looking at this in the context of 45 years of membership of the EU and what happens in the next multiple decades, I think there's considerable reason for optimism, but there has to be a reality or a realism that the divergences that we've been talking about are going to grow, and if it becomes a necessity to have a WTO set of arrangements, then that's indeed, I think, what will prevail, and I think Johnson will accept that is better than what might be being forced on him.
And then one wonders what the political effect might be if that leads to rises in prices and shortages of goods and various problems. Simon, would you say that wouldn't happen? Do you think that's alarmist?
Well, I think there's a lot of debate about where those price rises might occur. I mean, we've had substantial sterling devaluations. One of the commentators earlier on talked about sterling's problems. I mean, sterling's rallied 10% against the euro in the last 6 months and up quite a bit against the dollar. So much of that price component will also depend on exchange rates. I mean, exchange rate movements, as we know, dwarf tariffs. So we're broadly existing in a disinflationary world, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of change in that backdrop. So I don't worry particularly about sharp ramp-ups in inflation.
John Worth, the last word is falling to you, sir. You have about 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Ultimately, you have to look at it this way. Britain can either get a quick deal with the European Union, or it can get a good deal with the European Union. It has to choose between one or other of those. And ultimately, that's what we're going to see, I think, over the next 11 months, is basically the machinery of Brussels, the determination, the commitment, the well-prepared nature of the negotiators, particularly Michel Barnier, the lead EU negotiator, is ultimately going to get what it wants in this negotiation, because Britain knows what it doesn't want, but it can't actually articulate a positive vision for itself post-Brexit. And so ultimately, we're going to see a lot of those things that we've seen over the last 3 years are going to be repeated in this next 11 months. We're probably not going to get a no deal. We're going to get a deal which is in the interests of the EU, probably not one that's in the interests of the UK.
And I suspect we will talk about this one again many times over the next 11 months. John Worth of the College of Europe, Bruges, speak to us from London. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. Simon Brewer, former Chief Investment Officer at Morgan Stanley. Thank you, sir, for joining us as well. Did it again, didn't I? Sorry about that, sir. Catherine Cohen from the Pontian Assas University and the Crew Economic Research Unit Lab. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks to Michel de Fabiani from the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce. Stay with us. Media Watch is coming up right now.